This is a real problem in churches. Not just in the culture, but in churches. You've probably been in churches where there were tensions between newcomers and old-timers. There were also always in churches, there are tensions between younger people and older people. There is division between those who prefer a more traditional style of music and those who prefer a more contemporary experience of worship. There's division between those who are highly educated and those who are less educated. In fact, I could go on, but the list of the things by which we feel alienated would be miles and miles long. Alienation from God always leads to alienation with one another and other people. It is the source of all tensions between all people groups in the world. You would think by now, for example, that the Palestinians and the Jews would have found some way to get along. All they've been doing, not just for decades, but for centuries, is killing each other. And every new wave of violence spurns a whole new wave of violence. It's just a repeated cycle. And this has been going on millennia. Now here's what I find really interesting about the whole situation. Here are two groups of people who are closer ethnically than probably any other groups in the world. They've lived in that same part of the world for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. They have the same descendants. They have so much in common, but they are so far apart and they are so divided that there is no way that you're ever going to get these people to get even in the same room to talk about having peace. I don't care who's the President of the United States. I don't care who talks about peace. These two groups of people are never going to have peace. Do you know why? They're never going to have peace until they know what Paul talks about here, the peace of Christ. This is what I find interesting. At the very center of their conflict is where Jesus died on the cross to bring peace between groups of people. First, we have to have peace with God. And if we have peace with God, we can be at peace with one another. And there on the hill where Jesus died on Calvary, all these people do is shed blood with each other because of their centuries-old hatred. And if only these two people who have so much in common come to know the peace of Christ, they could be at peace. But no, that's not going to happen. Not until they come to know Christ. But this is the reason for racial division, the sense of alienation. This is the reason for the so-called ethnic cleansing that has taken place, particularly in the 20th century, as late as the 1990s that we saw in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I remember a peace march that largely destructed into bickering. Get this, a peace march that destructed into bickering. Try to imagine that for a moment. It began in Los Angeles, only to stall out in Barstow, just 120 miles outside of Los Angeles, when half of the 1,200 marchers went home in disgust. Those who remained were so polarized over those who were the real walkers and those who rode in their cars. They fought over a dress code. They decided to hold an election, but they disagreed over who can vote, finally deciding that even children could vote. Then the election was declared invalid. Many ended the peace march, by not speaking to each other. And I thought to myself, now here is a parable for what is wrong in our churches. Here is a parable for what is wrong in our culture. And again, the Bible tells us that when we are not right with God, we will not be right with other people. There will be division. There will be hostility. There will be barriers. There will be walls. There will be tensions. And the resultant state will always be one of alienation. Always. Robert Louis Stevenson tells the story of two unmarried sisters who shared a single room. This was many years ago. And as people were apt to do who live in such close quarters, the sisters had a falling out. Stevenson said it was over some minor point of theology. The controversy was so bitter that they never spoke again, ever. There were no words, either kind or spiteful, just grinding silence. One room. Nevertheless, perhaps because of a lack of material resources, they continued to keep house together in that single room. A line was drawn across the floor to separate their two areas. For years they coexisted in hateful silence. Each woman's meals, baths, and family visitors were exposed to the other's unfriendly silence. And at night, each woman went to bed, listening to the heavy breathing of her enemy. The two sisters lived this way the rest of their miserable lives. And you say, how awful! Yet is this not another parable for how many families and individuals and people groups respond to each other today? Is it not? The polarization may not be quite so stark, but it is just as real. I knew of a church one time that was so badly divided that half of the church sat on one side and the people of the building, and the people that they were mad at sat on the other side of the building, and the middle aisle down the church was literally the dividing wall of hostility. To say that this is not biblical, that it is not New Testament, would be a gross understatement. And it happens. And it happens because we lack the most essential thing to break down not only that kind of wall, but all walls. The peace of Christ. The peace of Christ is grounded in His sacrificial work on the cross, as we are informed in verses 13 and 14. Those who were far away, Paul says, were the Gentiles. Those who were near were God's Old Testament people, the Jews. The blood of Christ, though, made it possible for both regenerated Jews and Gentiles to come profoundly near. Why? Because, as Paul says in our passage that we just read a moment ago, He Himself is our peace. That is, He is the peacemaker, not only between those who cannot get along with each other, those who are alienated from each other, but also the God with whom we are at odds with, that causes such division and animosity in the first place. When people are genuinely at peace with God, it spreads like ripples in a pond to other people as well. Paul tells us that Jesus, in this passage, made the two one, and that He has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. He calls it here in our text. And what's he talking about? There was in Herod's temple at the time a wall that separated the court of the Gentiles from the rest of the temple. Yet on that wall were instructions written in Latin and Greek that forbade Gentiles from going any further. Now understand this. The court of the Gentiles was there as a part of the temple so that those non-Jews who had an interest in the Jewish God, the one true God, could come into the court of Gentiles, mix with Jews, and learn about the Jews' one true God and give themselves to Him. It was a great time of evangelism. It was a place for evangelistic activity. It was a place where other nations could come to know the one true God. And yet, the Jews turned it into a dividing wall. By putting those instructions on the wall, they were essentially saying to the Gentiles that if you do give yourself to the God that we know, then the God that we share with you, the one true God, if you give yourself to Him, that's all fine and good. But you have to stop right here. You can't worship Him because the Jews believed that He literally lived inside that temple, and the Gentiles were forbidden to go any further. You can go this far, but no further. You will always be on the outside looking in. You will always be second-class citizens. You will always be outsiders, and we will always be the insiders. And the apostle says that Christ has ripped that barrier down by His death, and thus both Jews and Gentiles alike have access, equal access, with the God who created them and thus created true spiritual unity. My friends, the ultimate answer to alienation is not intellectual. It's not political. It's not social. It's not technological. It's not economic. It is spiritual. Division at its root is a spiritual problem and thus requires a spiritual solution. And on the cross, Jesus provided that solution. He created literally a new humanity, as we read in verses 14 and 15. That's what he says. He created a new humanity. Anglican priest John Reed tells about driving a school bus in Australia which carried whites and Aborigines. And tired of all the squabbling that took place on the bus, one day when he was far out in the back country, he pulled off to the side of the road and he said to the white boys, "What color are you?" And they said, "White." And he said, "No, you're green. Anyone who rides on my bus is green." And he looked outside the window, and they knew that they were miles and miles and miles and miles from anything in the Australian outback, and they got the message real quick. They were either going to be green or they were going to walk. Anyone who rides on my bus is green. So he says to them, "Now, what color are you?" And they said, "Green." Then he turned to the Aborigines and he asked them, "What color are you?" And they said, "Black." "No, you're green. Anyone who rides on my bus is green." And then they answered him, "Yeah, okay, we're green too." Problem resolved, or so he thought. Until several miles down the road, he heard a boy in the back of the bus who announced, "Okay, light green on one side and dark green on another side." Human nature, again, rearing its ugly head. But Bishop Reed had the right idea. What was needed was a new race. But he could not pull it off. All human efforts at resolving division, this does not mean we should not strive to do so, but all human efforts at resolving division are ultimately doomed to failure unless we deal with the most fundamental problem, a species that is at odds with its own Creator. When we are reconciled to God, then and only then is it possible for us to be reconciled with other people. That is why I'm sure that God finds it galling, to say the least, that so many of His people are so uninterested and so uninvolved and so unmotivated with regards to the mission that He has given us to share the gospel with other people. We see all this division around us. We feel and we experience the polarization on many levels personally. We see the multiple global conflicts that occur all around us every day. We watch the news or we listen to the news, or if you're like me, you read the news and you feel helpless to do anything about it, if you feel anything at all. But we are not helpless, nor are we powerless. What do you think would happen if all the people who genuinely know Christ, not just those who think they do, but who genuinely know Jesus, what do you think would happen if all the people who genuinely know Jesus began to share Christ enthusiastically and as often as possible? What do you think might possibly happen? Because if we're really, really interested in seeing barriers removed and walls destroyed and the alienation that divides people resolved, then we would understand that when God does a work in a person's life, that person becomes literally, according to the Bible, a new creation. When we become new creations, divisions are destroyed and a new race emerges. Listen, a new race emerges. It's a race called Christians. And it's a race that knows no geographical distinctions, no geographical boundaries, no racial boundaries, no ethnic distinctions, no language barriers, no tribal allegiances except one. Jesus is Lord. And once that new race emerges in a culture, the whole culture begins to change. It happened in the first century. As Christians began to share the gospel and began to spread out throughout the Roman Empire, Christianizing almost the entire Roman Empire. They crossed boundary lines. I hesitate to share this with you because I was told this in confidence, but I won't say enough of it for you to know. I know of a church that meets every Sunday in a Western European country, in an area of town in a large city that is predominantly Islamic. But it's a church that meets there in secret. And in this church, Arabs, Jews, Caucasians, Asians, African Americans, every walk of life, 27 national entities, people from 27 different countries, grew up in 3 or 4 different religions, come together on Sunday. All those differences are set aside because they focus on the peace of Christ, because they know Christ. And little by little, that church is changing their neighborhood. Now, if people ever found out these people were meeting together, and for the purpose that they were meeting, they would be destroyed. But instead of being destroyed, they are destroying the walls, the barriers, the distinctions, making inroads because of their common allegiance to Jesus Christ. And that's what we must do. But we have to get serious about our mission. And we're not. That has to change. Let's pray together. God our Father, I come to you now and I thank you that you can take so much division and so much polarization and you can end it all. And you have ended it all, theoretically, on the cross. But you can end it all when you change our hearts and change our lives and transform us so that we become a new race. And our only allegiance is not to our tribe, not to our ethnicity, not to our language group. Our only allegiance is to you alone. When that starts happening among Christians throughout the world, when that starts happening even with all of us gathered here this morning, then we'll begin to see things change in our culture. And I suspect, Lord, the reason we haven't seen much change in our culture is because we haven't seen much change among Christians. Please, God, before it's too late for our culture, before it's too late for our churches, change us. Change us in such a way that there really is deep and abiding change, where we have the peace of Christ. In His name, amen.